The morning sun blazed down on Fort Henderson as 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her father's dusty pickup truck. Her small hands gripped the straps of an oversized camouflage backpack that seemed to swallow her tiny frame. The military base stretched endlessly before her, a maze of concrete buildings, training fields, and uniformed soldiers moving with purpose. Sarah's father, Colonel James Mitchell, had brought his daughter to the base for Bring Your Child to Work Day. It was supposed to be a fun, educational experience, a chance for military families to show their children what life on base was really like. Sarah had been excited for weeks, carefully selecting her outfit, a miniature set of camouflage fatigues that her father had gotten tailored just for her. As they walked across the main courtyard, Sarah noticed the stares. Soldiers stopped their conversations to watch the small girl in military gear walking beside the respected colonel. Some smiled warmly, remembering their own children back home. Others looked puzzled, wondering why such a young child was dressed like a soldier. The first group they encountered was a squad of sergeants taking a break near the weapons training facility. Sergeant Rodriguez, a tough-looking man with arms covered in military tattoos, nudged his companion when he spotted Sarah approaching. "Well, well, look what we have here," Rodriguez called out with a smirk. "Looks like the Army's recruiting them younger and younger these days." His fellow sergeants chuckled as Sarah and her father drew closer. Sergeant Thompson, a bulky man with a crew cut, crossed his arms and grinned. "That's some serious camouflage there. Little soldier, you planning to take over the base?" Sarah looked up at her father uncertainly. Colonel Mitchell's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. He knew his men meant no real harm, but he also knew his daughter was more sensitive than she appeared. "This is my daughter Sarah," Colonel Mitchell said firmly. "She's here for the Family Day program." Sergeant Williams, the youngest of the group, couldn't resist adding his own comment. "Does she come with her own pint-sized weapons too? Maybe a toy rifle to match that outfit?" The sergeants burst into laughter, enjoying what they saw as harmless teasing. They had no way of knowing that this 12-year-old girl had been shooting competitively since she was 8 years old. They couldn't have imagined that she spent every weekend at the shooting range with her father, or that she had already won 3 state-level junior marksmanship competitions. Sarah's cheeks flushed red, but not from embarrassment. She felt a familiar fire building inside her chest, the same feeling she got when other kids at school made fun of her for being different. She had always been small for her age, always been the quiet one who preferred books and target practice to dolls and dress-up games. "It's okay, Dad," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the mockery she had just endured. "I know they're just joking." But Colonel Mitchell could see the determination in his daughter's eyes. He had seen that look before, usually right before she accomplished something that surprised everyone around her. Sarah had inherited more than just his military discipline. She had also gotten his competitive spirit and his refusal to back down from a challenge. The tour continued, with the sergeants following at a distance, still making occasional comments about the miniature soldier walking ahead of them. Sarah visited the communications center, the medical facility, and the vehicle maintenance garage. At each stop, she asked intelligent questions that impressed the officers showing her around. But it was when they reached the shooting range that everything changed. The outdoor range was busy with soldiers practicing their marksmanship skills. The sound of rifle fire echoed across the field as targets were hit and missed in equal measure. Sergeant Rodriguez had followed the group to the range, still amused by the sight of the small girl in camouflage. He watched as Sarah's eyes lit up at the sight of the shooting stations, the way she automatically assessed the wind conditions and checked the position of the sun. "I bet the little soldier would love to try her hand at the big kids' toys," Rodriguez said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Several other soldiers turned to look, curious about the commotion. Colonel Mitchell was about to respond when Sarah stepped forward. "I would like to try," she said simply, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the range. The sergeants exchanged glances, their amusement growing. They had no idea what they were about to witness. Rangemaster Sergeant Davis, a grizzled veteran with over 20 years of experience, looked down at Sarah with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Sweetheart, these aren't toys. These are real military weapons with real recoil. Maybe you should stick to watching for now. But Sarah's father knew better. He had seen his daughter outshoot grown men at civilian ranges. He had watched her maintain perfect form and composure under pressure that would rattle experienced shooters. Still, he hesitated. This was different from the controlled environment of a civilian shooting range. This was his workplace, surrounded by his subordinates, who were already skeptical about a child's presence on the base. "Please, Dad," Sarah said, looking up at him with those determined eyes. "Just one shot. I promise I'll be safe." The crowd of soldiers had grown larger, drawn by the unusual sight of a 12-year-old girl requesting to use military weapons. Some looked concerned for her safety. Others seemed amused by what they assumed would be a harmless but futile attempt. Sergeant Thompson leaned over to Rodriguez. "This should be entertaining. Think she can even lift one of those rifles?" Rodriguez grinned back. "If she can hit anything besides dirt, I'll eat my own boots." The challenge in the air was palpable. Sarah could feel the weight of their expectations. The assumption that she would fail spectacularly. She had faced this kind of doubt before, but never in front of so many people, and never with stakes that felt so personal. Rangemaster Davis looked to Colonel Mitchell for guidance. The colonel studied his daughter's face for a long moment, seeing the quiet confidence there that he knew so well. Finally, he nodded. "One shot," he said. "Standard safety protocols. And Sarah? You know the rules." Sarah nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." As Rangemaster Davis began explaining the safety procedures, the crowd of watching soldiers continued to grow. Word was spreading quickly through the base that Colonel Mitchell's young daughter wanted to try her hand at military marksmanship. Some came out of curiosity, others out of concern for the child's safety. The weapon selected was a standard M4 carbine, modified for training purposes but still a serious piece of military equipment. As Sarah approached the firing line, the rifle looked enormous in her small hands. The sergeants who had been mocking her earlier exchanged knowing looks, their grins widening. "This is going to be over before it starts," Sergeant Williams whispered to his companions. "She probably can't even hold it steady." But as Sarah settled into position, something remarkable happened. Her entire demeanor changed. Gone was the uncertain 12-year-old who had been the target of jokes just moments before. In her place stood a focused, disciplined marksman who moved with practiced precision. She checked the weapon with the efficiency of someone far beyond her years, testing the sight alignment and adjusting her grip with subtle movements that spoke of extensive training. The watching soldiers began to murmur among themselves, their amusement slowly giving way to surprised interest. Sarah took her position at the 100-yard line, the standard distance for basic marksmanship training. The target was a human silhouette with scoring rings, the same target that had challenged countless soldiers over the years. Many experienced shooters struggled to consistently hit the center rings at this distance, especially on their first attempt with an unfamiliar weapon. The range fell silent as Sarah settled into her shooting stance. Her breathing became slow and controlled, her focus narrowing to nothing but the target downrange. The weight of the rifle, which had seemed so overwhelming moments before, now felt perfectly balanced in her hands. Colonel Mitchell watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He knew what she was capable of, but he also knew that this moment would define how his men saw both him and his family for years to come. The sergeants who had been so amused by Sarah's appearance were no longer laughing. They watched with growing amazement as the small girl demonstrated textbook shooting form, her movements precise and confident. This was not what they had expected to see. Rangemaster Davis called out the final safety check, his voice carrying the authority of years of experience. "Range is hot. Shooter, you are cleared to fire when ready." Sarah's finger found the trigger, her breathing steady and controlled. The entire base seemed to hold its breath as she prepared to take her shot. In that moment, everything she had learned, every hour of practice, every competition she had won, came together in perfect focus. The morning sun continued to beat down on Fort Henderson, but now it illuminated a scene that no one present would ever forget. A 12-year-old girl, in oversized camouflage, about to prove that sometimes the most powerful surprises come in the smallest packages. The stage was set for a moment that would change everything the watching soldiers thought they knew about judging others by their appearance. The crack of the rifle echoed across Fort Henderson like thunder. For a moment, complete silence followed, broken only by the whisper of wind across the desert training ground. Every eye on the range strained to see the target 100 yards downrange, where a small hole had appeared dead center in the bullseye. Rangemaster Sergeant Davis lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face showing complete disbelief. He had been running this range for 15 years, had seen thousands of soldiers take their first shots, but he had never witnessed anything like what he had just observed. "Perfect bullseye," he announced, his voice carrying a note of amazement that made every head turn. "Dead center, textbook shot." The crowd of soldiers erupted into surprised murmurs and whispered conversations. Sergeant Rodriguez stood frozen, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the small girl who had just accomplished what many trained soldiers struggled to achieve. His earlier jokes about eating his boots suddenly seemed less amusing. Sarah calmly engaged the weapon's safety and set it down with the same practiced precision she had shown throughout her shooting sequence. Her face remained composed, but those who looked closely could see a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had heard every mocking comment, every dismissive laugh, and now she had her answer. Colonel Mitchell felt a surge of pride so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. He had known his daughter was talented, but watching her perform under this kind of pressure, in front of his own men, filled him with an emotion he struggled to name. It was more than pride, it was vindication, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated because of their age, size, or appearance. "How did she do that?" Sergeant Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The bulky man who had been so confident in his mockery just minutes before now looked like he had witnessed something impossible. Rangemaster Davis called for the target to be retrieved and examined. As the paper silhouette was brought back to the firing line, the perfect hole in the center ring was visible to everyone present. There was no denying what had happened. A 12-year-old girl had just outshot most of the soldiers on the base. "I don't believe it," Sergeant Williams muttered, shaking his head. But Sarah's father knew better. This wasn't luck. This was the result of years of dedicated training, countless hours at the shooting range, and a natural talent that had been carefully nurtured and developed. Sarah had been shooting competitively since she was 8 years old, starting with a youth rifle program at their local shooting club. The story of how Sarah had discovered her talent was one that Colonel Mitchell loved to tell, though he rarely got the chance in a military setting. It had started as a way for father and daughter to spend time together during his brief periods of leave. What began as simple target practice had quickly evolved into something extraordinary when Sarah's instructor noticed her exceptional hand-eye coordination and natural steadiness. "Ma'am," Rangemaster Davis said, addressing Sarah with a respect that hadn't been there moments before. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah looked up at the grizzled sergeant, her nervousness from earlier completely gone. "My dad taught me the basics, but I've been shooting competitively for 4 years now. I practice every weekend when Dad's home." The information hit the assembled soldiers like a second shockwave. This wasn't a lucky shot by a child playing with adult weapons. This was a trained marksman who happened to be 12 years old. The sergeants who had been so quick to judge her began to realize how badly they had miscalculated. Word of Sarah's incredible shot was already spreading throughout the base. Soldiers from other units began arriving at the range, drawn by rumors of what had just happened. The story grew slightly with each telling, but the core truth remained the same. A little girl had just shown up an entire group of experienced soldiers. Major Harrison, the base's training officer, arrived just as Sarah was finishing her safety check of the weapon. He had heard the commotion from his office and come to investigate, expecting to find some kind of training accident or equipment malfunction. "What's all the excitement about?" Major Harrison asked, looking around at the unusually large crowd gathered at the range. Rangemaster Davis gestured toward Sarah, who was now standing quietly beside her father. "Colonel Mitchell's daughter just put a perfect bullseye at 100 yards, sir. First shot, unfamiliar weapon." Major Harrison's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared under his military cap. He looked down at Sarah, then at the target that was still being examined by several amazed soldiers. "Is that so?" he said, his tone carefully neutral. "And how old are you, young lady?" 12, sir, Sarah replied, standing a little straighter under the Major's scrutiny. Major Harrison nodded slowly, processing this information. He had been in the military for 23 years and had seen his share of exceptional marksmen, but never one quite this young. Would you be willing to try again? Just to make sure that wasn't a fortunate accident? The challenge in his words was gentle but clear. Sarah looked up at her father, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. The crowd around them grew quiet again, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Yes, sir, Sarah said simply. This time, Rangemaster Davis moved the target back to 200 yards, doubling the distance and significantly increasing the difficulty. At this range, wind conditions became a major factor, and even experienced soldiers had to carefully calculate their shots. The sergeants who had mocked Sarah earlier watched with growing anxiety, secretly hoping she would miss and restore their sense of order to the world. Sarah approached the firing line again, but this time, her movements were watched by dozens of pairs of eyes. The pressure was enormous, but she had learned long ago how to block out distractions and focus solely on the fundamentals of marksmanship that her father had drilled into her. She studied the wind flags carefully, noting the direction and intensity of the breeze. She checked her sight alignment twice, made a minor adjustment, and settled into her shooting position with the same calm confidence she had shown before. The range fell silent again, as Sarah controlled her breathing and found her natural point of aim. But this time, the silence felt different. It was charged with anticipation and disbelief. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would become part of base legend for years to come. Range is hot, called Rangemaster Davis. Shooter, fire when ready. Sarah's second shot rang out across the desert, the sound seeming to echo longer than the first. This time, there was no need for binoculars to see the result. Even at 200 yards, the hole in the center of the target was visible to the naked eye. Another perfect bullseye, Rangemaster Davis announced, his voice filled with genuine awe. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. The crowd erupted into spontaneous applause, led by Major Harrison himself. Soldiers who had never seen Sarah before were clapping and cheering for the small girl who had just accomplished something remarkable. Even the sergeants who had mocked her earlier found themselves joining in the applause, their earlier skepticism completely forgotten. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah as she was completing her post-shooting safety procedures. His face was red with embarrassment, but he managed to meet her eyes as he spoke. Miss, I owe you an apology, he said formally. I was wrong to make fun of you earlier. That was some of the finest shooting I've ever seen. Sarah looked up at the big sergeant who had seemed so intimidating just an hour before. It's okay, she said with the grace of someone far older than 12. I'm used to people thinking I can't do things because I'm small. Her words carried a weight that hit every adult present. Here was a child who had learned to overcome prejudice and doubt through skill and determination, who had turned mockery into motivation and used it to fuel her excellence. Sergeant Thompson and Sergeant Williams approached next, both looking sheepish and impressed. We were out of line earlier, Thompson said. That's some serious talent you've got there. Sarah nodded politely, accepting their apologies with the same composure she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. But inside, she felt a satisfaction that went far beyond hitting a target. She had proven herself in a way that would be remembered and respected. Colonel Mitchell watched the interaction with deep pride, but also with a new understanding of his daughter's strength. He had always known she was talented, but seeing how she handled both the mockery and the praise showed him that Sarah possessed something even more valuable than marksmanship skills. She had character. As the crowd began to disperse, many soldiers stopped to speak with Sarah, asking about her training and expressing their amazement at her performance. She answered each question thoughtfully, showing the same patience and respect that had been missing from her earlier treatment. The morning that had started with jokes and dismissive laughter had transformed into something completely different. Sarah had not only proven her shooting ability, but had earned genuine respect from some of the toughest soldiers on the base. But this was only the beginning of what would become an unforgettable day at Fort Henderson. News of Sarah's exceptional shooting spread through Fort Henderson like wildfire. By lunchtime, her story had reached the ears of Captain Elena Rodriguez, the base's chief marksmanship instructor, who had been training elite snipers for the past 8 years. Captain Rodriguez had heard wild stories before, but something about this one intrigued her enough to seek out Colonel Mitchell and his remarkable daughter. She found them in the base cafeteria, where Sarah sat quietly eating her lunch while soldiers from various units stopped by their table to introduce themselves and ask about her shooting. The 12-year-old handled each interaction with remarkable poise, answering questions about her training and technique with the precision of someone far beyond her years. "Colonel Mitchell," Captain Rodriguez said as she approached their table, "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I'm Captain Rodriguez, and I've been hearing some incredible things about your daughter's performance at the range this morning." Colonel Mitchell stood and saluted. "Not at all, Captain. Please, join us." Sarah looked up at the approaching officer with curiosity. Captain Rodriguez was different from the other soldiers she had met that day. There was something in the woman's eyes that suggested she understood the technical aspects of marksmanship in a way that went beyond basic military training. "Sarah, isn't it?" Captain Rodriguez said, settling into the chair across from them. "I train the base's precision marksmen. And I have to say, what you accomplished this morning has gotten everyone's attention. 2 perfect bullseyes with an unfamiliar weapon is impressive for anyone, but for someone your age, it's almost unprecedented." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. She had grown comfortable with the praise and questions from the regular soldiers, but this woman clearly knew more about shooting than anyone else she had encountered that day. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied politely. "I've been practicing for a long time." Captain Rodriguez smiled. "I can tell. The fundamentals you displayed this morning, breathing control, sight alignment, trigger squeeze, those take years to master. Your father tells me you compete in civilian competitions?" "Yes, ma'am. I've won 3 state-level junior championships and placed second at nationals last year." The information caused Captain Rodriguez to raise an eyebrow. National-level competition shooting was a different world entirely from the basic marksmanship that most soldiers learned. It required not just natural talent, but dedication, discipline, and technical knowledge that many professional soldiers never acquired. "That's extraordinary," Captain Rodriguez said, genuine admiration in her voice. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in seeing how military precision shooting differs from civilian competition shooting?" Sarah's eyes lit up with immediate interest. "Yes, ma'am. I would love that." Colonel Mitchell looked uncertain. The morning's events had already exceeded his expectations, and he wasn't sure how much more attention he wanted his daughter to receive. But seeing the excitement in Sarah's eyes, he found himself nodding his agreement. An hour later, Sarah found herself at the Advanced Marksmanship Range, a facility that most soldiers on the base never saw. This was where Captain Rodriguez trained the base's elite marksmen, where shooting was elevated from a basic military skill to a precision art form. The range was equipped with targets at distances ranging from 300 to 800 yards, with advanced spotting scopes and environmental monitoring equipment that measured wind speed, humidity, and even subtle changes in air pressure. It was a shooter's paradise, and Sarah absorbed every detail with fascination. Military precision shooting is different from competition shooting in several important ways, Captain Rodriguez explained as they walked along the range. Competition shooting is about achieving perfect scores under controlled conditions. Military shooting is about achieving effective results under any conditions, often while under stress, with equipment that may not be perfectly calibrated. She gestured toward a target set up at 500 yards. At this distance, factors like wind drift, bullet drop, and even the rotation of the Earth become significant. A civilian shooter might have time to calculate these factors precisely. A military marksman often has to make rapid adjustments, based on experience and instinct. Sarah studied the distant target, automatically calculating the challenges it would present. 500 yards was far beyond anything she had attempted in competition shooting, where the maximum distance was typically 200 yards for junior competitors. "Would you like to try?" Captain Rodriguez asked, her tone carefully casual. The question sent a thrill of excitement and nervousness through Sarah. This was beyond anything she had ever attempted. A test that would push her abilities to their absolute limits. She looked up at her father, who was standing nearby with an expression of mixed pride and concern. "Dad?" she asked quietly. Colonel Mitchell studied his daughter's face, seeing the determined gleam in her eyes that he had come to recognize. "It's your choice, Sarah. But remember, this isn't a competition. There's no shame in not being ready for this level of challenge." Sarah nodded, understanding what her father was really telling her. He was giving her permission to fail, to encounter something beyond her current abilities, without it diminishing what she had already accomplished that day. "I'd like to try," she said firmly. Captain Rodriguez led her to the firing position, where a military sniper rifle waited on its bipod. The weapon was significantly larger and more complex than anything Sarah had used before, equipped with an advanced telescopic sight and precision adjustments that required detailed knowledge to operate effectively. "This is an M24 sniper weapon system," Captain Rodriguez explained, her voice taking on the tone of an instructor. "It's designed for precision shooting at extended ranges. The scope has adjustments for elevation and windage that allow for accurate shooting at distances up to 800 yards. Sarah approached the rifle with the same careful respect she had shown all day. But this time her examination was more thorough. She studied the scope adjustments, tested the trigger pull, and checked the bipod stability with the methodical approach of someone who understood that equipment familiarity was crucial to accurate shooting. A small crowd had gathered to watch, word having spread that the remarkable young shooter from the morning was about to attempt something even more challenging. Among the observers were several of the base's trained marksmen, soldiers who knew exactly how difficult the shot Sarah was about to attempt would be. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, one of Captain Rodriguez's top students, watched with professional interest. 500 yards with an unfamiliar weapon and scope, she murmured to her companion. "That's a challenging shot for anyone." Wind's picking up too. Indeed, the wind had increased noticeably since the morning, creating variable conditions that would require constant adjustment and careful reading of environmental factors. The flags along the range showed gusts coming from multiple directions, creating the kind of complex wind pattern that challenged even experienced snipers. Captain Rodriguez knelt beside Sarah as she settled into position behind the rifle. "The scope is already zeroed for 100 yards, she explained. "For a 500-yard target, you'll need to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift. The wind is coming from your right at about 10 miles per hour, with gusts to 15. Sarah nodded, absorbing the technical information, while her mind automatically began calculating the adjustments needed. This was far more complex than anything she had encountered in competition shooting, where wind conditions were typically mild and distances much shorter. She peered through the scope, marveling at the clarity and magnification that brought the distant target into sharp focus. Through the advanced optics, she could see details of the target that would have been invisible to the naked eye, but she could also see how the crosshairs seemed to dance slightly in the wind, requiring constant adjustment to maintain proper aim. "Take your time," Captain Rodriguez advised. "This isn't about speed. It's about understanding all the factors that affect the shot and compensating for them properly." Sarah spent several minutes studying the target and conditions, watching the wind flags and trying to identify patterns in the gusts. She made small adjustments to the scope, raising the elevation and compensating for the wind drift based on her calculations and observations. The crowd of watchers had grown larger, with soldiers from across the base arriving to witness what many were calling an impossible shot. The betting among the observers was mixed. Some believed that Sarah's earlier success meant she could accomplish anything, while others felt that the increased difficulty would finally reveal the limits of what a 12-year-old could achieve. Colonel Mitchell stood off to one side, his emotions cycling between pride, nervousness, and amazement at how the day had unfolded. When he had brought Sarah to the base that morning, he had expected a simple educational tour. Instead, his daughter was about to attempt a shot that would challenge a trained military sniper. "Range is hot," Captain Rodriguez announced. "Shooter, you are cleared to engage when ready." Sarah settled deeper into her shooting position, her breathing becoming slow and controlled, as she entered the focused state that had become second nature to her. But this time, the challenge was greater than anything she had faced before. The distance, the wind, the unfamiliar equipment, and the pressure of performing in front of an audience of professional soldiers all combined to create a test that would determine whether her morning's success was the beginning of something extraordinary or simply a remarkable science fluke. Through the scope, the target seemed impossibly small and distant. The crosshairs wavered slightly, as gusts of wind affected her stability and changed the bullet's flight path. Everything she had learned about shooting fundamentals would need to be perfect, and even then, success was far from guaranteed. The desert wind picked up again, causing the flags to snap and flutter unpredictably. Sarah waited, her finger poised on the trigger, searching for the perfect moment when all the variables would align in her favor. She had learned patience from years of competition shooting, but this required a level of precision and timing beyond anything she had previously attempted. In that moment of perfect stillness, with the entire base watching and her reputation hanging in the balance, Sarah prepared to discover whether she truly possessed the exceptional talent that everyone hoped to see, or whether she had simply been lucky enough to succeed twice, at a level appropriate for her age and experience. The desert fell silent except for the whisper of wind across the sand. Sarah held her breath, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered that familiar zone of perfect concentration that had served her so well in competition shooting. Through the powerful scope, the 500-yard target looked clear but impossibly small, the crosshairs dancing slightly in the variable wind. She waited for the wind to settle, watching the flags along the range for the brief moments of calm that would give her the best chance of success. Years of competitive shooting had taught her patience, but this was different. This wasn't just about winning a medal or trophy. This was about proving herself to an audience of professional soldiers who understood exactly how difficult this shot would be. The moment came suddenly. The wind flags dropped, indicating a brief lull in the gusting that had been complicating her aim. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, applying smooth, steady pressure as she had done thousands of times before. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. For what seemed like an eternity, everyone strained to see the distant target. Captain Rodriguez had her spotting scope trained on the 500-yard marker, her experienced eye searching for the impact point of Sarah's bullet. "Hit!" she called out, her voice carrying a note of amazement. "Center mass, just outside the X-ring. Outstanding shot." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause that could be heard across half the base. Soldiers who had watched the shot with professional skepticism were now shaking their heads in wonder. Sergeant First Class Santos, one of the base's top marksmen, looked stunned. "That's a shot that would challenge any of my advanced students," she said to her companion. The fact that a 12-year-old just made it on her first attempt at this distance is absolutely incredible. But Sarah wasn't finished. As the applause died down, she looked up at Captain Rodriguez with a question in her eyes. "Could I try once more? I think I can do better with the windage adjustment." Captain Rodriguez stared at the young girl with growing amazement. Most shooters would have been thrilled with the near-perfect shot Sarah had just achieved. The fact that she was analyzing her performance and seeking to improve it showed a level of dedication and perfectionism that reminded the captain of her most elite students. "The wind has picked up even more," Captain Rodriguez warned. "It's going to be even more challenging now." Sarah nodded, studying the wind flags that were now showing stronger and more variable gusts. "I noticed the wind shift right after I fired. I think if I compensate a little more for the right-to-left drift, I can get closer to center." The technical analysis impressed everyone within earshot. Sarah wasn't just lucky or naturally talented. She understood the science of long-range shooting well enough to make calculated adjustments based on observed results. "All right," Captain Rodriguez said. "One more shot. But remember, you've already accomplished something remarkable. Don't let perfectionism take away from what you've achieved." Sarah settled back into position, this time making subtle adjustments to her scope settings based on what she had learned from her first shot. She spent even more time reading the wind conditions, waiting for the optimal moment to fire. The crowd had grown larger, with word spreading throughout the base that something extraordinary was happening at the advanced range. Major Harrison had returned, bringing with him several other officers who wanted to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Among the new arrivals was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wells, the base's executive officer, who had served multiple tours in combat zones and had seen the work of military snipers under fire. She watched Sarah's careful preparation with the eye of someone who understood the discipline and skill required for precision shooting. "I've worked with some of the best marksmen in the military," Lieutenant Colonel Wells said quietly to Major Harrison. "The level of focus and technical understanding that girl is displaying is remarkable for someone so young." Sarah's second shot rang out just as the wind began to calm again. This time, the result was even more impressive. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried clearly across the range as she announced the result. "Perfect X-ring hit, dead center at 500 yards. The stunned silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Soldiers emerged from buildings across the base, drawn by the commotion and the spreading word that something historic was happening at the range. Sarah stood up from the firing position, her face flushed with excitement and pride. She had just accomplished something that many military snipers trained for months to achieve, and she had done it with an unfamiliar weapon in challenging conditions. Colonel Mitchell approached his daughter with an expression of pure amazement. "Sarah, that was incredible. I'm so proud of you." But the day's surprises weren't over. As Sarah was receiving congratulations from the assembled soldiers, a black SUV pulled up near the range. Out stepped Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of Fort Henderson, who had heard the reports of the extraordinary young marksman and had come to see for herself. The entire range snapped to attention as the general approached. Sarah, uncertain of the protocol, stood as straight as she could and tried to look as military as possible in her oversized camouflage uniform. "At ease," General Hayes said with a smile. She looked down at Sarah with genuine curiosity. "So, you're the young lady who's been causing such a stir on my base today?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. General Hayes had commanded troops in 2 combat deployments and had worked with some of the finest marksmen in the military. She understood the significance of what Sarah had accomplished, not just in terms of marksmanship skill, but in the way she had handled the pressure and scrutiny of performing in front of professional soldiers. "Captain Rodriguez tells me you just made a perfect shot at 500 yards with equipment you'd never used before. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. It took me 2 shots to get the windage right, though." The general's eyebrows rose at Sarah's matter-of-fact response. Most soldiers would have been boasting about their achievement, but this 12-year-old was analyzing her performance and acknowledging areas for improvement. 2 shots to achieve a perfect hit at 500 yards with an unfamiliar weapon system, in variable wind conditions, under pressure from an audience of professional soldiers, General Hayes said slowly. "That's not something to apologize for, young lady. That's something to be proud of." She turned to address the assembled soldiers. "I've been commanding this base for 3 years, and I've seen many impressive displays of marksmanship, but I've never seen anything quite like what this young woman has accomplished today. She's shown us that excellence has no age limit, and that we should never underestimate someone based on their appearance or our preconceptions." The general's words carried special weight coming from the base's commanding officer. For Sarah, who had started the day being mocked by sergeants who thought her camouflage uniform was a costume, the validation from the highest-ranking officer on the base was overwhelming. "Sarah," General Hayes continued, "you've shown remarkable skill and composure today. More importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of character and determination that we value in the military. While you're obviously too young to enlist, I want you to know that you've earned the respect of everyone on this base." The formal recognition from General Hayes marked a turning point in Sarah's day. What had begun as a simple bring-your-child-to-work visit had evolved into something much more significant. Sarah had not only proven her shooting ability, but had shown a level of maturity and grace under pressure that impressed everyone who witnessed it. As the crowd began to disperse, many soldiers stopped to speak personally with Sarah, sharing their amazement at her performance and asking about her future plans. Some of the same sergeants who had mocked her that morning were now among her most enthusiastic supporters, having learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of judging others too quickly. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had made the crack about eating his boots if Sarah could hit anything, approached with a sheepish grin. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "You've taught me something important today about keeping an open mind." "That was some of the finest shooting I've ever witnessed." Sarah accepted his words graciously, showing no trace of smugness or desire for revenge, despite the treatment she had received earlier. Her response demonstrated a maturity that impressed the adults around her even more than her marksmanship skills. But the day's events had set in motion something larger than anyone realized. Word of Sarah's exceptional performance was already spreading beyond Fort Henderson, and there were those in the military community who would soon take notice of the 12-year-old girl who could outshoot trained soldiers. 3 months after that remarkable day at Fort Henderson, Sarah Mitchell found herself standing on a very different kind of stage. The National Youth Shooting Championships were held annually in Colorado, bringing together the most talented young marksmen from across the United States. This year, however, the competition had attracted unusual attention from military recruiters and shooting sports professionals who had heard the story of the 12-year-old girl who had amazed an entire Army base. Sarah had qualified for the national championships before her visit to Fort Henderson, but her performance that day had transformed her from a promising young competitor into something of a legend in shooting sports circles. Videos of her shots, taken by soldiers on their phones, had circulated through social media and military networks, earning her recognition far beyond her age group. The competition was fierce, with teenagers from across the country who had been shooting competitively for years. Many of them had heard about Sarah's military base performance and were eager to test themselves against the girl who had become famous for outshooting trained soldiers. Standing at the 300-yard line, Sarah felt the familiar calm settle over her as she prepared for the final round of competition. The target seemed small and distant, but after her experience with the 500-yard military targets, this distance felt manageable. More importantly, she had learned something crucial during that day at Fort Henderson. She could perform under pressure, even when everyone was watching and expectations were high. Her father stood in the spectator area, wearing his dress uniform and beaming with pride. Beside him stood Captain Rodriguez, who had taken leave to attend the championships and support Sarah. The relationship that had begun that day at the base had evolved into a mentorship that was helping Sarah develop skills far beyond her age level. "Final round, competitors," the range officer announced. "This round will determine the national champion in the junior division." Sarah's closest competitor was Marcus Chen, a 16-year-old from California who had won the junior nationals twice before. Marcus had the experience and technical knowledge that came with 4 additional years of competitive shooting, but Sarah had something different. The confidence that came from proving herself against professional soldiers in conditions far more challenging than any competition. As Sarah settled into her firing position, she thought about the lessons she had learned at Fort Henderson. Captain Rodriguez had continued working with her, teaching her advanced techniques for reading wind conditions and making rapid adjustments for environmental factors. More importantly, she had learned that her size and age could be advantages rather than limitations. She was steadier than many adult shooters, and her analytical mind allowed her to make technical adjustments with remarkable precision. The first shot of the final round rang out across the Colorado mountains. Sarah's bullet found the X-ring with the accuracy that had become her trademark. Around her, other competitors were shooting with varying degrees of success, but Sarah had learned to block out everything except the fundamentals of marksmanship that had been drilled into her through years of practice. Shot after shot, Sarah maintained perfect consistency. The techniques she had refined during her training sessions with Captain Rodriguez served her well, and the pressure of competing against older, more experienced shooters felt manageable after her experience performing in front of skeptical soldiers. As the competition progressed, it became clear that the final outcome would be decided between Sarah and Marcus Chen. Both were shooting with exceptional accuracy, but Sarah's shots were displaying a level of consistency that impressed even the tournament officials. In the spectator area, Colonel Mitchell watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. The shy, small girl who had been mocked by his sergeants just a few months earlier had developed into a confident young woman who commanded respect through her performance rather than demanding it through her words. "She's shooting like a seasoned professional," Captain Rodriguez observed. "The mental discipline she's developed is remarkable for someone her age." The final shot of the competition would determine the national champion. Sarah had a narrow lead, but Marcus Chen was an experienced competitor who had performed well under pressure before. The tension in the spectator area was palpable as Sarah prepared for her final shot. She went through her pre-shot routine with the same methodical precision she had shown at Fort Henderson. Environmental conditions were assessed, sight picture verified, breathing controlled, and trigger squeeze applied with smooth, consistent pressure. The shot was perfect, another X-ring hit that secured Sarah's victory as the youngest national champion in the competition's history. The achievement was remarkable not just for its rarity, but for the way Sarah had earned it through consistent excellence, rather than a single spectacular performance. As she stood on the podium to receive her gold medal, Sarah looked out at the audience and saw faces that had become familiar over the course of her shooting career. Her father stood in the front row, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Captain Rodriguez applauded with the enthusiasm of a mentor who had watched her student achieve something extraordinary. But perhaps most meaningfully, Sarah spotted several soldiers from Fort Henderson who had traveled to Colorado to watch her compete. Among them were Sergeants Rodriguez, Thompson, and Williams, the same men who had mocked her camouflage uniform and doubted her abilities just months before. Now they cheered louder than anyone, having learned firsthand never to underestimate someone based on their age or appearance. After the award ceremony, Sarah was approached by reporters who wanted to interview the record-setting young champion. She handled their questions with the same composure she had shown throughout her shooting career, answering thoughtfully and giving credit to her father and Captain Rodriguez for their role in her development. "What's next for you?" one reporter asked. "Do you have plans to pursue shooting sports at the collegiate or professional level?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I want to keep improving and learning. Captain Rodriguez has taught me that there's always more to learn about marksmanship, and I want to see how far I can develop my skills." The reporter followed up with another question. "There are rumors that military recruiters are already interested in you, despite your age. Is military service something you've considered?" Sarah glanced toward her father before answering. "My dad has shown me what military service means, and I respect it tremendously. Right now, I'm focused on school and continuing to improve as a shooter. But yes, military service is something I think about for the future." Her answer reflected the maturity and thoughtfulness that had impressed everyone who had worked with her. Sarah understood that her exceptional shooting ability came with opportunities, but she also understood that success required continued dedication and development. As the day wound down and the crowds began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by the people who had supported her journey. Her father's pride was evident in every word he spoke, and Captain Rodriguez beamed with the satisfaction of a mentor who had helped unlock exceptional potential. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Sergeant Rodriguez approached her with something in his hands. "I wanted to give you this," he said, holding out a military challenge coin. "A small medallion given to recognize exceptional achievement or service. This is from the entire squad that met you that first day. We had it made specially to commemorate what you taught us about not judging people by their appearance." Sarah accepted the coin with genuine emotion. On one side was the Fort Henderson insignia, and on the other was an engraving that read, "Sarah Mitchell, proving excellence has no age limit." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice carrying the sincerity of someone who understood the significance of the gesture. "That day at Fort Henderson changed everything for me. Not just because of the shooting, but because everyone there helped me understand that I could earn respect through my actions." As they walked toward the parking area, Colonel Mitchell reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple "bring your child to work" day, but it had evolved into something much more significant. His daughter had not only discovered the extent of her own capabilities, but had taught valuable lessons to everyone who witnessed her performance. The story of Sarah Mitchell would continue to be told at Fort Henderson for years to come, serving as a reminder to soldiers about the importance of keeping an open mind and never underestimating others based on preconceptions. But more importantly, it had become a story about how talent, dedication, and character could overcome any obstacle, regardless of age, size, or initial skepticism from others. Sarah's national championship was just the beginning of what promised to be an extraordinary journey in competitive shooting. But the foundation for that success had been laid on a dusty army base in the desert, where a 12-year-old girl in oversized camouflage had proven that excellence recognizes no boundaries except those we impose upon ourselves. As they drove away from the competition, Sarah clutched her gold medal and the challenge coin from Fort Henderson, symbols of achievements that represented far more than shooting accuracy. They represented the triumph of determination over doubt, skill over skepticism, and character over prejudice. The little girl who had been mocked for her camouflage uniform had become a champion, proving that sometimes the most powerful victories are won not with words, but with flawless performance when it matters most.